Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the campus-wide Tutor Professional Development on Reading Across Disciplines. Bonnie Cook, Elizabeth Nersessian, Dion Pincus, and I welcome you to today's event. Today's collaborative professional development is due to Diane Call's vision and Arthur Coradetti's leadership. For those of you who did not receive the announcement, Diane Call has officially been nominated and has been received as the Vice President and Provost of Queensborough Community College. And Arthur Coradetti is the Dean of Assessment and Accreditation, and he now has brought all of the directors of the learning centers together to collaborate on many projects, professional development being one of them. Since all tutors are employed in learning centers that support Queensborough Community College's mission, it seems more than appropriate that resources are pooled to support initiatives which cross disciplines. Tutoring reading is such a topic. No matter what discipline we tutor, we encourage students to read the text of the discipline. But often, the discipline's text is a mystery to the students who come to our tables. In preparing for today's introduction, I spent a lot of time talking and discussing the reading phenomenon with a number of readings experts who are in the room today. One of the common threads in the conversation is that the easiest strategy to share with tutees who experience difficulty with text is to reread. And I'm stopping because it is such a simple strategy, right? Reread it. And it really is hard as an educator, as a teacher, to understand why people don't like to reread. But we need to encourage that one strategy, especially when the text is so complex. And they need to be reassured that rereading is okay for everyone to do. It doesn't matter if you are a PhD. It doesn't matter if you have 3 PhDs and a JD and everything else. Everyone rereads at some point when they're reading text. And this is just an aside, but I cannot tell you how many times I have to read and reread the traffic signs in Manhattan because I find them one of the most perplexing things to read. And my husband has often said, Joe, why don't we just take pictures of these signs and use them with your students? Because if you really look at it, you need to reread that you can park at a certain place and you have to pay it at the machines at some point, and then on Sundays you don't have to, but they leave so much information out. So rereading is one of those strategies that we really need to be encouraging across the entire campus. We also need to encourage our students that we work with to stay focused with the text. We live in a society of instantaneous gratification, so we don't understand that sometimes we need to stick with something a little bit more. We need to motivate the students we work with to stay focused on goals. So many of our students just are really trying to survive on a day-to-day basis, that sometimes they need to just be reminded, what is your goal? Stay focused on that goal. Write the goal out somewhere and keep looking at it. Your job here at Queensborough is an admirable one. I often share with tutors that it's not a job, it's a vocation that's called you. The other very important element that tutors need to know and to appreciate is that you are sometimes the only connection that a student may have with Queensborough. So that the student sees a reflection of Queensborough through the way you behave and the way you act. So that when you're patient, the student sees patience reflected from Queensborough. When you go that extra step, when you stay those extra few minutes, with especially not getting paid, which is not acceptable, But it does happen that students see Queensborough going that extra step. We would hope that the students do see you as the person, that they see you, Al, that they see you, Regina, that they see you, Philip. But often that's not the case. Often they see Queensborough. When you shine, they shine. And one of the reasons that we spend time with tutor training is because we know that the better trained our tutors are, the better the support they will give our students. And when the students succeed, they credit Queensborough. I don't know what goes on in the other centers, but I can tell you that when one of our students succeeds, they come back. Do all 125 come back? No. But we always get that percentage of students who come back, and they look for you. They don't look for me. They don't look for Miss Cook. They don't look for Miss Necessian. They don't look for Mr. Pincus. They look for you. Where is Philip? And I'm sorry I'm only using the tutors in my place, but I don't know your names. But they come looking for you. So again, I can only speak in the name of all of the directors that we are so appreciative for who you are and what you do. You make our jobs so easy. And we thank you. Today, we are taking time out of all of our centers. It is the first time that I know of since I've been here where all the learning centers have closed for a few hours so that we can spend some time together exploring the mystery of reading comprehension. We will hear what researchers suggest may be reasons why some students find the reading process challenging and defeating. And we will hear from faculty and tutors who will share best practices that attempt to assist students with overcoming these hurdles. We hope that the conversations that begin today will continue when we all go back to our discrete centers. And we hope that we will convene in a few months to either continue this conversation or to move toward another tangent topic. More importantly, we hope that you enjoy today and that you have fun. It is supposed to be a day where we really just relax, move out of our comfort zones, meet people from other areas, and just have some really good conversation. As I look around the audience, I see that we have some guests that I'd like to acknowledge before I introduce our keynote. I'd like to welcome Professor Christopher Davis from John Jay College, Professor Jelani Warsi from Queensborough, and then I'm trying to see who else is here. Then we have faculty from our departments who are here to share their wisdom. Professor Glenn Birdie is here. I see Professor Professor Rehor from Basic Skills, Professor Izzo from Basic Skills. Lucille Cardinale is here. Lucille, raise your hand. Lucille Cardinale is a retired public school principal who started her career as a teacher and has moved her way up. And then she inherited a school where the school children in her school were reading at that very difficult level. I don't remember the terminology. But by the time that she decided that she wanted to retire, the children in her school tripled the reading level. I think they went from something like 25%.
29 to 70.
So we have her among us because the strategies that are used in reading cross disciplines and cross ages. It doesn't matter. Strategies are strategies. So today we're privileged to have Ms. Ashley Minihan begin our conversation. Ms. Minihan is the tutor trainer for the Center for English Language Learners, both at John Jay College and here at Queensborough. Her expertise is in assisting tutors who tutor English language learners. Today's emphasis will be on helping students understand the language of textbooks. May I ask you to please help me to welcome Ms. Minihan.
Everybody. Good morning. I'm going to open up my PowerPoint presentation here. As Mrs. Pantaleo mentioned, I have been working for about 4 years now as a tutor and a tutor trainer at the Center for English Language Support at John Jay College, and I've also had the good fortune to be an instructor here as well in the Basic Skills Department. And a lot of my work was made possible by a Title V grant from the Department of Education. And through that grant, we started the new Center for English Language Learners here on campus, which is a tutoring center specifically geared towards helping non-native speakers with their writing and their reading for their content classes. And the purpose of this grant was to it helped make tutors more, one of the many purposes. There were numerous purposes of this grant, but one of them was to help make tutors more aware of the academic needs of non-native English-speaking students, and also to help tutors make their work with these students most effective. Now, my work has been primarily with non-native speakers. However, I think you'll find that some of the issues that we're going to discuss today in this presentation really are applicable to most of our students here at Queensborough. Even though a student may think of himself or herself as a native speaker, may consider English his or her dominant language, that line between non-native speaker and native speaker could get quite blurry. So a large number of our students, I think, whether they sound like a native speaker or not, I think could benefit from some of these strategies that we're going to talk about today. So my presentation is going to be largely related to the problems that students encounter when they read their textbooks and other academic materials. And I'd just like to kind of get an idea, get a show of hands. Who here in their work with students has found that students have trouble with textbooks? All right, great. So I see that this seems to be an issue kind of for most of you. Anybody have some help, some suggestions? What are some of the things that students have trouble with their textbooks? Yes, sir.
They don't read it.
They don't read it? Okay, great.
They don't open it.
Yes, Professor Izzo.
Number one complaint.
Sorry?
The number one complaint in my classes the other day, not even with my textbook.
Right.
I haven't even assigned it yet.
Oh.
Boring.
Boring, okay. So they don't read it, they think it's boring. Any other issues? Any other complaints, thoughts? Yes, ma'am. Complicated, yeah, definitely. Complicated. All right, so that's a great, I'm so glad she made that comment, because that's going to tie us into the next, basically the entire presentation. Why are textbooks complicated for students? All right, well first, they're complicated on the level of the chapters. All right, the broader level issues. All right, first of all, students often lack background knowledge about what they're going to read. Okay, that's especially if they're non-native speakers, maybe if they didn't originally grow up in this country, if it's a history textbook that they're reading, they could lack a lot of the background knowledge that it's maybe assumed the student might have. Textbooks contain a lot of information. I mean, I most often hear from my students when I say to them, well, why do you find textbooks difficult? There's just so much. There's so much language. There's so much information. And a lot of times students aren't familiar with how information is presented in a textbook. They don't really quite understand. We've got the chapter, then we've got the major sections, then we've got the subsections, then we've got the subsections of the subsections, and then we have a pullout. It's kind of overwhelming. All right, so they don't really fully understand, and then they lose track of how that information is structured. They lose the thread. So those are some of the broad level issues, the big picture issues that students have with their textbooks, but they also have issues with the individual sentences that they're reading. These sentences themselves can really pose a lot of problems for students. And one reason is that the vocabulary is abstract and unfamiliar for the students, and we're going to talk about much more about that, what we mean about that. And the sentences, each word in the sentence, or at least each noun or verb in the sentence, often contains a lot of information, just in one word or one phrase. So what I sort of think, I think about a textbook chapter or even a section It's like a suitcase, and it's packed full of so much information. And we have to help figure out, how do we unpack the information that's included in these books for these students? So there are a couple issues going on here. In order to be able to understand what they're reading in their textbooks, students need to be able to understand both the main ideas, so some of those chapter level issues that we were talking about, but they also have to be able to understand the individual sentences that make up the text. So it's a two-part issue that we're dealing with here. Now, a lot of really great work has actually been done on the subject of helping students understand on the broader level what they're reading, helping them find main ideas, helping them go to section titles and get a sense of what they're about to read from the section titles, previewing, skimming, going to the end of the chapter to look at the notes about what they're going to learn. Those are all great strategies, excellent strategies. And those can help the students have a better sense of how their ideas should be organized, both when they read and then when they write. So these strategies are excellent, and in no way do I mean to take away from how beneficial and useful these strategies are. But this presentation is actually going to focus more on helping students unpack the language that they're reading on the sentence level. And I'm just going to put the question out to you, why is it important? I mean, if the student understands the general ideas about what he or she is reading, why do you think it may be important to also focus on the sentence level of the writing? The actual sentences that make up these paragraphs or chapters. Yes?
Because if they have difficulty understanding the individual words in a sentence, they're going to misinterpret the content of the entire paragraph.
Definitely. Definitely. That's great. So even if they have a general, broad idea of what they're what they're reading about, or what they're going to read about, they can absolutely lose the thread of what they're reading on that sentence level. Any other ideas about why? That was a great point. Yes?
I feel like a lot of students are overwhelmed by just the page itself. So if they get more confidence, like knowing that they can tackle these sentences individually, then they'll be able to then understand the assignment.
Wonderful. Sure. Yes, ma'am.
Understanding the sentence, but you have them to understand like unscrambling the puzzle.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great metaphor. Yes, unscrambling the puzzle. These sentences are like puzzles for a lot of our students. Great. I'd also like you to think a little bit about writing, because we become better writers through what we read, right? So not only is it a reading issue, we want to help them solve the puzzle, we want to help them engage more deeply in what they're reading, not just get these very broad general ideas, but really specifically understand what they're reading. And then writing is also a bit of an issue because the students need to be able to eventually incorporate some of these structures that they're reading into their own writing to have it become more academic. Right? This is how we learn to write in an academic way. It's very often not explicitly taught to us. We sort of assimilate it as we read. However, if the student encounters this text like a wall that there's no way to get through or comprehend, they're not going to be able to assimilate these structures and then maybe in some way hopefully use them themselves. So we're going to break down, the first part of this presentation is basically going to be looking at why, what are the elements that make the language so difficult. So we're going to talk about the fact that these textbooks are written in academic English. And academic English is like sort of a language unto itself. It's sort of like a new language. So a lot of our students maybe already learned English as a second language or a third language, and now they're coming to college and they're confronting academic English, which is sort of a new dialect for them, basically. So academic English is very abstract, and we'll talk about what that means in a second, and it's very dense. And again, that gets back to that idea of a lot of information contained in a few words. And And as we've mentioned now before, these qualities, the abstractness, the denseness, make it intimidating, alienating, and so you get these reactions like it's boring, or I don't want to do it, right? And that can be frustrating as an educator to encounter that attitude, but I think we also have to have a little bit of sympathy for the student. The student is having this emotional reaction to something that he or she can't really access. And so let's talk a little bit about that abstractness. What is it that makes, so we're going to get a little bit of grammar, sentence structure discussion here. So first of all, the subjects and the objects of these sentences are often abstract concepts. So let's take a look at an example. This was taken from an ethnic studies textbook. Ethnic studies is it's like a sociology discipline. It's a required course for John Jay students. So let's look at this sentence. At the turn of the century, the need for justification of the Jim Crow system created an especially negative brand of racism in the South. The subject is the need for justification of the Jim Crow system. Okay. Who is that? What is that? I don't really know. Right? Created, okay. You probably know what created. An especially negative brand of racism. Okay, that's probably a little more accessible. Racism may, most students have some idea what racism is. But again, it's not a clear actor. It's not a clear person or thing who is doing something. I can't really imagine this in my mind. I can't really picture it when I read it. Okay? So that could be a problem. The other element of academic English that makes it abstract is the use of the passive voice. Now, the passive voice, some of you may be familiar with this idea. The passive voice is when you have a sentence and the subject of the sentence did not actually do the action. The subject of the sentence receives the action. Am I allowed to write something on the board? Yeah. Let me just quickly. This is a very simple example of a sentence in the passive voice. Okay? The boy is the subject of the sentence, but he didn't actually do the action in this sentence. He received the action. The ball actually did the action in the sentence, all right? Now, a lot of academic English is written in the passive voice, and unfortunately it's not as simple as this sentence, all right? Because academic English has a tendency to kind of be more objective, to remove a sense of action or a sense of who is doing what. And so because of that, we get sentences where it's not really clear who is doing any kind of action in this sentence. So here are some examples from a sociology textbook. An affective tie may be reinforced. Deviance, then, is needed to define and sustain morality. Who is doing this? We don't know. We're not sure. All right? Or possibly we do get a sense of who is doing this. We might learn who is doing this. But in the second example, the actor comes at the end of the sentence. The principle of individual and group compensation for damages done by others is accepted by the federal government and the larger society. Okay, so the federal government and the larger society is who or what is doing the action, but it comes at the end of the sentence, and that's very different than the structure of normal, regular conversational English. All right, regular conversational English, whoever did it comes at the beginning of the sentence, then there's a verb, what they did, and then maybe there's an object. They hit the ball, right? The thing that they hit. But that's not the way a lot of academic English structures are presented. So that can be a problem. Next, let's look at the density. The fact that I said there's a lot of information packed into terms. So let's look at some examples here. So here we have a couple of examples. The first two are, again, I think, sociology terms. The last is a scientific term. We have 2-word or 1-word phrases, and really, to explain them, it would require an entire sentence if we were doing this in conversational English, right? If we were using conversational English. So, especially if you look at that middle one, dramaturgical analysis, that's a 2-word phrase that takes 3 lines to explain in conversational English. When sociologists analyze how people interact in society and analyze them like they would analyze a performance in the theater. There's a lot that we unpacked out of that 2-word phrase. So that's, that can definitely be an overwhelming element of academic English. Another issue is that when terms are explained, often, and they often are in textbooks, there are a lot of definition sentences in textbooks. A lot of terms are defined. That's often the point of a textbook, is to define certain terms for students. But what happens is the way they're defined ends up being in these really long phrases that kind of go on and on and on. So let's look at a couple examples of these. So we have from a sociology textbook, the term anomie refers to a feeling of anxiety and disorientation that comes with the breakdown of traditional life in modern society. There are a lot of parts to that definition. And we knew, as fluent speakers and users of academic English, we saw, okay, there are prepositions. We can break it up, the prepositions to, of, in. We can break it at that. We saw these natural breaking points, but a student wouldn't necessarily see those. All right, let's look at another example. Fragmentation is a means of asexual reproduction whereby a single parent breaks into parts that regenerate into whole new individuals. Again, long and relatively inaccessible. All right? So this gives you some idea of what our students are struggling with. These abstract concepts where you can't really visualize who or what is doing anything, right? So that's a problem. And then you have these terms, these phrases that actually contain so much information just within them. And then when the textbook sometimes does try to explain them for the students, they do them in these very long phrases that are hard to figure out. All right? Before we move into the next part of the presentation, which will be about strategies for helping students with these structures, are there any questions, comments, anything anyone wants to add? All right, so let's, now we're going to think about some strategies here. And the 2 main strategies we're going to discuss is being aware of how some of these complex sentences are structured, becoming aware of that, and then hopefully helping students a little bit by showing them how these sentences are structured, or at the very least, being able to break down the sentences for the students to help them. And then also encouraging the student to ask, as he or she is reading the sentence, who or what is doing what. That way, making the sentence become more like a sentence in conversational English, as opposed to a sentence in academic English. So now we're going to look at a few different sentence structures. And first I'm going to give you, these are some classic examples of classic definition sentences from textbooks. The first one, not so much. The first one is just to kind of give you an idea of a clue of the structure. But the second 2 are, one is from a sociology textbook and the other is from a biology textbook. So in your folders, you should have copies of this slide. Should look like this. And what I'd like you to do, maybe with the person sitting next to you or with the group of people sitting next to you, just take a couple minutes, see if you can find, there's a pattern pattern. There may be even more than one pattern, quite frankly, but see if you can find any patterns for how you could help a student break down this information, process this information. And you can maybe start with the first sentence, because the first sentence is a little more accessible. And then see if you can apply the pattern from the first sentence to the next two. Okay, everyone. Seems like we had some good conversations going on here. Don't worry, you're going to get to do this again with two other kinds of sentences. So the conversation is not over. Which group, which tutors came up with some ideas for what maybe some structures of these, some patterns that these sentences tend to follow? Yes, Professor Izzo.
Well, we notice in the first and third sentence, there is a key. As bad as those sentences are, the key is the most commonly used word in the English language is, which means an equal sign.
Ah, very
Get our
nice.
students to realize that any form of the word is by itself usually denotes an equal, then maybe we can see it's supposed to be balanced. You got a very simple subject out, and what comes after it. Okay.
Right. That's great. That's great. So to make the student realize that that is term is sort of like, you can almost make it a little more visual for the student, a little bit more kind of like a math problem. This equals this. And can be defined as is very similar. I mean, you could make that into an equal sign too, really. I mean, let's not get too hung up on the nuances here of is versus can be defined. I mean, that's just another way of expressing a definition that is often used in these definition sentences. So sure, that's great. So you have the term that's being defined equals the definition. Great. Anything else? Any other ideas? Yes?
One of the things that we did was we took out the words like is, can be, is, and we took extraneous words out and then translated, read it, and translated in our own words. And I think that's one of the things that students don't do. They stick with every word.
Right.
And it gets all convoluted. So we took it. So for example, you said apple, you said it's a red, yellow, green skin fruit, and it's sweet, tart, crisp, whitish flesh.
Great.
So we kind of translated. It's kind of like what Joe Campanella said at the beginning. When you read a traffic sign, you translate it in your own words, and I don't think our students feel free to do that. They stick with the literal word, every word on the page.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yes.
But in breaking down a sentence, we always first want to find the subject, find the verb.
Okay.
The verb is, and then we're going to say who or what, who or what is what the after is. And then for the object, we're going to find is what, and then that's when we find the object.
Great. Great. These are all really good strategies. Really, really good strategies. Yes?
The help of the professor would say for that. At first, it explains what group the subject is a part of, and what makes that subject special within that group.
Beautiful. Beautiful. This group got a little extra help. Great. So let me then show you. I'm sorry, what was your name? Natalia. Let me show you what Natalia just very well explained here. So the pattern that we found in that, when we were working on this at the Center for English Language Support at John Jay, we kind of broke these definition sentences down. And there are clearly other patterns that are very good that you found. This is the pattern that we found. So let's start with the easier sentence, the apple sentence. So you have X, the thing that is being defined, is a part of a larger category, right? So apple is a part of the fruit category, all right? And then the rest of the definition is explaining how this example is different than other parts of the category, other members of the category, okay? So an apple has red, yellow, green skin, and sweet, tart, crisp, whitish flesh, which is different than an orange, which is different than a banana, which is different than a peach, right? So this is what's special about the apple as a member of the fruit category. Okay, so now we can look at some of the slightly more complicated, more academic sentences. It sort of follows a similar pattern. Matriarchy, Okay, that's X, that's what's being defined, can be defined as a social organization, that's the category. How does it differ from other social organizations? It's a social organization in which females dominate males. Okay? Same thing with the lysosome. It's part of what category? It's part of the enzyme category. How is it different than other members of its category? It's in sweat, tears, and saliva, and it attacks bacterial cell walls. Okay? Questions about that? Relatively clear? Okay. So now I'm going to show you another kind of sentence. Another sort of typical sentence pattern that you might find in a textbook. So again, with your group, your partner, see if you can find, this one probably isn't too difficult to find. Let's see if you can find a pattern. Thanks again for your interest and active participation in this. There's going to be one more sentence type to dissect, so the fun's not over yet. Okay. So, what was a pattern or a few patterns? Yes.
We noticed that the first half of the paragraph gives you a factual statement,
Uh-huh.
and then the second half points out examples of exceptions to that statement.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So there was one statement, and then the second half of the sentence is maybe contradicting some examples that go against that original statement. Sure. Yes.
The very first words in both sentences, although and whereas, tell the reader, immediately that there's going to be some sort of comparison or some sort of conceding appeal to the reader. Like, okay, this is how this is going to work, but I'm going to say that there's also this.
Right.
That contradicts this.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Yeah, those two words in the beginning of the sentence right away tell us that there's going to be some kind of contrast presented here between these two ideas. Very common. Happens a lot in textbooks. So it's good to make students aware of these words that indicate a kind of contrast. It doesn't have to be a contrast. Let's look at the way we kind of approach these sentences. And again, this is one approach. It's not the only approach, needless to say. The way we approach these sentences is that the first part of the sentence is like a comment on what is then going to be the main idea, the main point of the sentence that is found in the second part of the sentence. And yes, there absolutely is a contrast between the first part and the second part in both sentences. But what might be kind of interesting to notice just from the point of view of sentence structure, sentence syntax, is that the first part of the sentence in each of these is what we call a dependent clause. Does anybody know what a dependent clause is? It's kind of a fancy grammar term. Anybody know what that is? Yes, sir, in the back.
It's a phrase that needs to be attached to an independent clause to exist.
Great, good. Any other ideas, comments about what that means, independent clause? I don't mean to be neglecting this afternoon. Okay, yeah, he's absolutely right. A dependent clause is a part of the sentence that cannot stand by itself. By the version of, the difference between dependent and independent, right? If you put a period where the green part of each sentence ends, it would be what we call a sentence fragment. It would be a piece of a sentence, but not a complete sentence, okay? And the second part of the sentence is an independent clause, meaning it could stand by itself, all right? Now, from the point of view of meaning, the meaning, not just looking at the sentence structure, but the actual meaning, you could say, well, you still need both because you can't really fully understand the sentence without the first part. True. Absolutely true. However, just from the point of view of the sentence structure, the second part can stand by itself, the first part cannot. So the author is making his or her main point in the part that can stand by itself, and then there's a comment or a sort of contrast set up with the first part of the sentence. All right? Now I'm just going to write on the board a few other of these words that indicate dependent clauses so that you can kind of be aware of them. Subordinating conjunctions, which is a fancy word basically meaning they introduce a dependent clause. And they can come either at the beginning of the sentence or they can come in the second part of the sentence too. But it's good, a lot of times a sentence in a textbook will be structured this way where there's a dependent clause in the beginning and an independent in the second part. And if you can kind of teach your students to be aware of some of these words, these all are contrasts. So if a student sees one of those phrases, you can tell your student, all right, immediately you know there's going to be some kind of contrast set up between these two ideas. The others are not so much contrast. They indicate other kinds of relationships. But again, it still kind of shows this comment main idea relationship. Questions about that sentence before we move on to our last sentence? Yes?
Yeah, we go a little further with some of the words and extend them one at a time. For example, the word if. One of the clues we can give our students is that all computers, and they like this one,
yeah.
All computers, if you go back to, I tell them big funny jokes about how I taught myself basic. I explain how corny basic is now.
Right.
Well, it wasn't corny 20 years ago.
Sure.
But all computers work with the idea of if and then.
Right.
If this happens, then that happens. I said, but in plain English, it's even simpler. If you're using the word if, there's got to be something else. There has to be something else in that sentence.
Great.
Which will explain then.
Great.
Cause and effect, results. And then you can even start looking at, when you get the higher patterns of rhetoric and organization, you can bring it right into the whole idea of causality.
Yep. Great. That's a wonderful point. Thank you. Yeah, it's good to, these are not such hard sentences to teach students how to write. The next sentence that we're going to look at, the next kind of sentence that we're going to look at is much harder for a student to write effectively. We just want to hopefully help that student read that sentence effectively. But it's not that hard to teach a student how to write a sentence that involves an independent and a dependent clause. It's kind of like academic English 101, right? So these are some strategies not only to help them read, but also to help them write, too. That if a sentence involves one of these words, there's got to be a relationship with another part of the sentence. It can't stand by itself. So that's both a reading and, in a way, a writing strategy as well. Great. Any other comments or things to add? All right, so now we're going to look at the last sentence type that I personally think is a little bit harder. So take a couple minutes again, look at these sentences. One of them is from an ethnic studies textbook and the other is from a biology textbook. Perhaps you found this kind of sentence the hardest. Maybe not. Maybe not. I personally find this kind of sentence the hardest to work with the students on. Did anybody find any kind of pattern? Yes, ma'am.
Using an example to explain a concept. So, for example, in the first sentence, you have European awareness.
Uh-huh.
Explain the inferiority versus the superiority of people.
Okay.
In the second example, you have snake mimicry experiment, which is the example. You have the concept of wonder, like missing out the effects of
Okay, great. Okay. So we've got, I think perhaps that works even the best for the second sentence. Yeah, I like that. You have this idea, it's an example, then we kind of explain the concept it's an example of. Great. That's an interesting strategy. Yeah, that's good. Anything else? Any other strategies that we found? Yes?
I think the first sentence is mostly like the subconscious.
Okay.
The awareness and then more what rather than more, basically something like races and then more.
Okay. I see what you're saying. So yeah, it's absolutely a complicated sentence. Yes?
Could you repeat that only because we couldn't hear it?
Sure. Can you maybe talk a little bit to the whole group?
The first sentence, it was like something more between it. Talking about one thing, European awareness, you have the word was, and mostly students will war, you will see races, you will war.
That's a great point. There are many reasons why these are complicated sentences. Many reasons why these are complicated sentences. But she's absolutely right. Let's look at the first sentence. The European awareness of the differences between the races. That is the whole subject of that sentence. All right, that is a very long phrase. And really, the main subject is European awareness, right? And then the rest of the phrase describes what kind of awareness, what were they aware of, right? But so awareness is really the subject of the sentence, but then you've got that long kind of phrase thing in between awareness and then the verb. So that could definitely confuse students. Definitely. And yes, it's highly possible that were they to try to write this sentence, they would put were instead of was. Absolutely, because races is right next to the verb. Any other patterns that people found? Yes?
Oh, I basically was, when we were talking about breaking the sentence down into a very general, and then the first one, this is linked to that.
Great.
This was linked to that.
Great.
And in the second one, this is an example of that.
Uh-huh.
And breaking down those parts even further.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Or even more, in the second one, this is an example of how they do that.
Yeah.
And then breaking those concepts.
Great. Yeah, that's kind of the general idea. That's sort of what we were thinking about when we saw these sentences. Yeah, this has a link to that. This is an example of that. Basically, you have a verb phrase linking two ideas, explaining a connection between two ideas. And then, once you maybe you start with finding that verb phrase, because that's sort of like the hinge between these two ideas. So if you can help the student find the verb phrase first, and then you find the two ideas that are being connected, and then probably you are going to have to break down the ideas even more. Because the ideas themselves are still, even those two ideas that are centered around that verb phrase are still kind of complicated. So you have awareness of what? What are they aware of, right? Notions of what? You probably would have to explain what notion means, right? Okay. And then the second one, maybe you don't have to break down the first part so much, but the second part, absolutely. Because there's so many of these prepositional phrases there. Of how scientists design experiments to test by canceling out effects of any, it's just lots of little pieces there. But I think absolutely, she's absolutely right. The first thing is to sort of realize that there's a connection between this and that. And then find the verb phrase that is the place where those two ideas are linked. But this is a hard kind of sentence, even probably for us to process a little bit. let alone the student. Any questions about this? All right. Well, we'll have more time for questions too at the end if anybody needs a little time to create their question. So now let's move on to a little bit about the strategy. We talked a lot about breaking down sentences. Now let's think about the strategy of helping students explain who is doing what. All right, so here I gave an example of a definition sentence from an ethnic studies textbook. And probably most of us, certainly most of us, and probably a lot of students are familiar with the term prejudice. It's a term that we hear a lot, a term that we use a lot. But the definition itself is a little bit abstract. Is the tendency of an individual to think about other groups in negative ways, to attach negative emotions to these groups, and to prejudge individuals on the basis of their group membership. All right, so a bit academic, a bit abstract. So what we're doing is we're taking this one sentence and we're kind of breaking it into 3 sentences with specific actors here. So prejudice happens when a particular person thinks about a group of people in negative ways. Who is doing what? Okay. Prejudiced person also has negative feelings about people in that group. Okay, again, a more clear relationship between who is doing what. And the prejudiced person also judges someone in that group before he/she gets to know that person simply because that person belongs to that group. All right? Much longer, much wordier, a little messier, quite frankly. It doesn't look as kind of nice and concise as the first sentence does. But it's more accessible because, to be honest, it's more similar to conversational English. All right, conversational English is messier than written, especially academic English. All right. We can give you another example of that. So this is one we looked at earlier. Now, the first part of the sentence actually does have a clearer subject and verb. People vary. Okay, so that's a clear subject. People, right, vary, but it's still written in a somewhat more sophisticated way. Probably still is a little bit inaccessible for the students. All right. So we change it to people definitely have different physical appearances. One sentence. And then the second part of the sentence is really abstract. It's really not so clear who is doing what. So people's different physical appearances are not the same as the differences between types of animals. Why do you think academic English is the way it is? I just wanted to throw that out there. Why do we write this way? I'm not really sure, to be honest. I'm throwing it out to you. Any ideas why textbooks are written this way, academic language is this way? Yes, Alex?
I think it's a mix of, this is maybe crazy, I think it's a mix of both logic and also a very old dialect that is used to keep the older power structure in power.
Okay. Yeah, it definitely has to do with power. He's absolutely right. I mean, this language has a lot of power to it. And we know it has a lot of power because it keeps people out. So he's absolutely right. There is a power structure inherent in this language. Absolutely. And legal documents are written this way. A lot of documents that make us scared to read are written this way. So he's absolutely right that there's a power dynamic inherent in this language. Sure. Any other ideas why we write this way or why there's a bias towards this kind of language in academic writing?
It's more formal as opposed to casual.
Right. Sure. Okay, great, yeah.
It seems to be less provocative.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe they're trying to go for a very mediocre, plain definition that can be timeless.
Okay, great. Did everybody hear what he said? That was a good point. You want to repeat for this side of the room? It's a little bit hard to hear.
It's very provocative in the sense that it doesn't have actors, or it doesn't take on that Shakespearean, like, okay, here's our play, this is what you see. It's very mediocre, so in a sense it could be more timeless. It can be read, 50 years from now, and it can be still interpreted the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think academic language tries, it's not always not provocative. Sometimes an article is written that's very provocative, but especially in a textbook, I think there's a tendency that the author wants to remove himself or herself. There's an idea that you need to be objective, right, and not inject your own opinion or your own actions. So it tends to create this language then that is very inaccessible because in a way it's very dry and emotionless, right? It's hard to connect emotionally to this language. So, great. Any other ideas? These are all excellent. I'm not really sure why we write this way, so I'm very open to people's ideas. Christopher?
Just to say, because I think there is this power and class thing going on, but there's also a functional need, because you're trying to say, in other words, just say, look how long, and this one's not so long, but the other one, you really have to say a lot of information in one sentence, and if you were really to explain everything and make everything easy to understand, it would be much longer. Also, sometimes you explain something, like let's say you've talked about a particular example of prejudice or something, and then you want to refer back to that. You just want a short way, like an abbreviation, like say, like for example, we said the need to just, that you were talking about the Jim Crow laws, the laws that excluded black people from participation in civic rights. You have a whole example of that. And then you're trying to explain, you're going to refer back to that. And you need to say the need for justification of that system. You need like a short phrase that can refer back to this whole process. And in science, that's especially true. In science, where you define a whole process, and then you have to say fertilization, and sometimes there's a long phrase. And so you do need to pack more information into the sentence. And so then it becomes more abstract because you use these nouns and you're relating one noun to another noun. So there is kind of a need to do it, but then at the same time, sometimes I think even when there's not a need to do it, it's done to create this distance between those who can be within this language and those who can't.
No, there is a need for this language. This language is not going to go away. There is a need, and Christopher's absolutely right. We can't really write textbooks this way because the textbook would be 3 times as long, right? And textbooks are already very expensive, right? So we need to kind of create a little bit of a code, shorten, make more concise. So it's not that this language is all bad. There is a use for it, there's a function for it. And for better or for worse, it is a kind of language that we use in situations of power, like the university, like legal writing. So it is important for our students to be able to access it and to understand it. So to wrap up, so what are the nitty-gritty? What's the nitty-gritty of what we can do when we're actually in a tutoring session? Now that we've kind of talked a little bit about the sentence structures, how they're organized, what can we do in a tutoring session? And once I've gone through this slide, which is our last slide, I'll open it up to some things that you guys do, because I'm sure you have some great strategies. So break complicated sentences down into parts, as we've discussed now quite a lot. And then once you've helped the student identify the parts of the sentence, try to encourage the student to explain what he or she can himself. The student is not going to really want to do this, but try to encourage him or her to do this, to do as much as he or she can. And some ways to help the student explain are to point out keywords in the sentence that the student would need to know in order to be able to explain. And this is kind of an interesting strategy. A lot of times we take for granted that reduce is contained in reduction. Or we take for granted that moral is contained in morality. but we should not assume that our student sees that connection. The student sees a form of the word that is unfamiliar and inaccessible, right? So sometimes you can help the student, first of all, by pointing out that these ION endings or these ITY endings are very common in academic English. They're noun forms. And the ION especially is used so much, and it basically makes an action into a noun. It describes a process, all right? So reduction is the process of reducing. All right? So sometimes if you can help the student find a word that he or she might know or might recognize, that can be a way in. And then the student realizes, oh, actually, I do kind of know this word, all right? And sometimes if you're tutoring a Spanish-speaking student or a Romance language-speaking student, there are a lot of similarities sometimes, because English borrowed a lot of words from Latin. All right, so sometimes, it doesn't always work, and sometimes you have what are called false friends. So the student might think he or she knows the word, but actually it's a different meaning. But a lot of times, the student, if he or she is a Romance language speaker, might see some connection. If the student still really is having trouble, still really can't do it, don't torture the student. You can explain. You can then explain to the student, but make sure when you're explaining to the student, make sure you connect the words you're using to the words in the text. So don't just shut the book and say, okay, now we're going to converse, right? There's always a temptation to do that. Instead, point to the words in the text that you're using. Like, for example, that example we saw in a previous slide with vary. People undeniably vary in their physical appearances. Well, if you want to say have different physical appearances, you could say vary, have different. Make that connection. Right? And then, as Mrs. Panaleo discussed earlier, have the student read it again. All right, once you've explained it, try not to just move on then. I know it's hard in a tutoring session, you don't have a lot of time, but actually, in a way, it's better to focus on a few passages, a few key passages with the student, because that way you're really going to build the student's reading skills, as opposed to just doing, 15 pages in a tutoring session. In a way, it's almost better to get that student to get down into the nitty-gritty of a few key passages. So have the student read it again. And then once the student has read it again, he or she can explain it to you. And try to get the student to do what you did. Try to get the student to connect the words that he or she is using to the words that are in the text. And hopefully through that process, the student starts to assimilate some of the vocabulary, some of the structures. It won't happen overnight, but it's at least a way to begin. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. And now I would love to open up, first of all, questions, if anybody has any questions, or also strategies that you use. Because reading is such a multifaceted skill, and it's really very, very difficult to teach someone how to be a better reader.